So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at some of the options in accounts payable. We're going to be looking at distribution codes and sets, some of the setup areas within vendors and how that relates to activity and recurring payables. Then we'll look at automatic payment runs and some of the ways that we can use that to drive greater efficiency within the accounts payable department. And then we'll follow that up with reports and inquiries, and at the end of the session, as usual, there'll be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. So let me exit the PowerPoint slide and I'll go straight into Sage 300. Just on a couple of admin notes, I am running Sage 300 2017. Now that is the latest release of Sage 300. So you may actually notice there's a few options in this version that you may be unfamiliar with. In other words, if you go open up an invoice entry screen, you may see different buttons, for example, than the ones you see here. Now I'll try and do my best to point out where there are differences with 2017 and other versions. But I guess we'll work through that, and hopefully, if you're thinking about moving to Sage 300 2017, then this will give you some food for thought on that subject as well. Anyway, let's jump straight into accounts payable, and as usual, I'll head straight into AP setup, the nuts and bolts icons, beginning with options. I'll go straight to the processing page and just highlight a couple of areas. One is retainage accounting. Now this typically is not something that everybody uses. In fact, it's probably the minority that use retainage accounting. But what I thought I'd do as part of accounts payable today is I'll just touch quickly upon retainage accounting because you may find that it's a feature that you could make use of in some way. So first of all, what is retainage accounting? Retainage accounting is where I receive an invoice from a supplier. I put the invoice into my system, and using the retainage accounting method within Sage 300, Sage will automatically calculate a retainage amount of that invoice, and we'll schedule that in as part of an age payables. We'll also split it as far as the GL account entry is concerned, and also from a GST reporting point of view. How does it work? Let's have a look. I'm going to dive straight into AP transactions and invoice entry. So here's a screen I'm sure you're all familiar with. I'll just make that bigger so we can see all the buttons down the bottom. Now I've started training myself to come straight into AP invoice entry screen rather than going into the AP invoice batch. But it's just another way of getting into the invoice entry screen. If I want to create a new batch, in other words, I don't have any open batches on the system, then I'll click the new button and it'll create a new batch. Here's batch 36, and I can just type in a description. You'll notice that my dates are 2020 being the fiscal year, and that's only because the sample company within Sage 300 prefers to work in the year 2020, so I hope that doesn't confuse anybody. The other point to note is that this sample company is based on a USD functional currency and USD tax authorities. So for the purposes of today's webinar, I'm actually going to skip all the tax-related areas because it just won't make sense for us here. Some retainage invoice. Okay, so I'm going to pick a vendor. In this case, Chloride Systems. I'll put in my document number. And you'll notice I've got a button here called Retainage, a little tick box. I'm just going to tick that. I'm going to delete this line. The reason why, I'm just going to go to the taxes page, and as I mentioned, I don't want to get caught up in US state, county and federal tax, so I'm just going to make sure that there's no tax calculation happening here today. Let's make my document total 250,000, for example. And I'll come straight to the GL line and let me find a GL account. There we go, cost of goods sold, 250,000. And what you'll see is that I've got some extra columns in my detailed line, all around the retainage accounting specifics. A lot of these I can override, so if I want to hold back more than 10%, then I'll just change that value there. Equally, I could change the retainage amount here. So currently my default setup for retainage accounting is to hold back 10%. I can also change the retention period. So if I want to change that to 30 days, and you'll see my retainage due date is updated accordingly. If I go to my totals page, you'll see here my total distribution is 250,000, giving me a total document of 250,000, but now I'm seeing that there's a retainage amount. So the net payable right now is one minus the other, 225. Remember, there's another 25,000 that'll be due on 10th of Jan 2021. I might change that. You can see I've got a duplicate invoice number checking system switched on. In fact, for the same amount. So I don't know if you're aware in Sage 300 Accounts Payable, we can actually set up duplicate checking not only on the document number, which happens by default, but for the vendor and the amount of the invoice. So in this case, I've got an invoice already against 1200 Chloride Systems for 250,000. The system is just giving me a warning that that's the case. It won't prevent me from doing anything further. Now you'll notice there's a button here called Post. I believe this is a new feature in 2017. So rather than coming away from this screen and having to post elsewhere, if I'm done, I can just hit that Post button. And it now goes ahead and posts the invoice. So in case you're wondering, in my general ledger batch list, I'll have a batch that's now come over from Accounts Payable. You can see the total is 250,000, but it's still done the correct split from an accounting perspective, so that the control account shows 225 being payable with an amount held back that will become due according to the due date that we saw in that line item of the invoice. Now, what most people who use retainage accounting do is they use in Accounts Payable Periodic Processing this little option here called Create Retainage Batch. If I was to change the date to, say, 31st of January, and I was to process, you'll see I get one document created and placed in batch 37. So back to our trustee accounts payable invoice batch list. You'll see I've got one new entry here, so I've moved forward in time to 31st of January 2021. If I pop that open, here's the remainder of that original invoice, the 25,000. If I'm happy with that, I can just go ahead and post. So that's a little bit about how Retainage Accounting works in Sage 300, and I hope that that's clear, and maybe you can find some use for it. Next, I'm going to move on to distribution codes and distribution sets. I've found over the years that a lot of people don't use these two areas, but what I've found is when people get to realize how these two areas can be of benefit, suddenly everyone goes gung-ho and sets distribution codes and sets up. So let me quickly explain. A distribution code, it's very simple. It's nothing more than a user-friendly name for a general ledger account. And that's why when I go into the Finder, I can see some distribution codes, some distribution descriptions, but the bottom line is that they're linked to a general ledger account. Now here's some examples I set up earlier. So I set up some distribution codes that represent some mobile telephone numbers. So there's 3 of them right there. And you'll see they're all linked to the same GL account, because on my GL, this is where I want to record the expenses for these mobile telephone numbers. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because when I then move to distribution sets, I can create a one-set code that combines all those distribution codes. So I'll show you what that means and how that works. Let me go and set up a distribution set. So in keeping with the theme, I'll call this mobile telephone charges. You'll see I've got distribution method options. Now the idea behind this is that when I get an invoice from, say, Telstra for some mobile telephone bills, rather than having to populate the distribution lines in the AP invoice entry with all the lines of the telephone numbers manually, I can get this system to do it for me automatically. I can also get it to distribute the document total amount based on the following methods. For the purposes of today, let's stick with manual, meaning that when I go put the invoice in, I'll manually assign the individual amounts to each individual line. So I'm just adding the distribution codes into the distribution set now. Okay. And remember, I could have 50 or 100 of these distribution codes all linked to this one distribution set. Now, if I dive into vendors, again, I'm pretty sure I set one up earlier. Yes, there we are. So I've got a vendor called Telstra Mobile. Now, you'll notice in Sample Company the vendor numbers are all numeric. I actually prefer to go alphanumeric. So you can see that my vendor is TL01. One of the reasons I like doing that is because when I come here, instead of having to go into the Finder, I can just type in the first 3 characters, then go into the Finder, and it'll take me straight to the first instance. Alright, now you're probably noticing there's a little sidebar opened up here. This is also a new feature in 2017. So within 2017, you're able to attach notes to transactions and master records, and you can have those notes pop up whenever you go to the relevant master record or transaction. In this case, I'd set one up previously saying when we open up this vendor, make sure that we see this message. Anyway, that's slightly digressing from what we're doing at the moment, but I thought I'll mention it anyway. So my vendor Telstra Mobile is currently set up to distribute by no method whatsoever. But I'm deciding now that I'm going to distribute all the invoices I get from Telstra Mobile by a distribution set that I've called mobile telephone charges. Let me just change these tax classes. Again, I'm not wanting to get into US tax codes right now. But I hope you get the idea. So I go to my vendor and I select to distribute by distribution set. I attach the distribution set to the vendor. And then when I come to do my next invoice against Telstra, it will look like this. November telephone, oops, I got a problem with my O. TEL, remember I can just type in TEL if I know it's the first one off the bat. There we go, Telstra Mobile. I'll put in the invoice number. And I'll put in the amount. Maybe it's, let's call it 9,000. And you'll see I've got already some information here to tell me something's going on. It's telling me that there's a distribution set called mobile telephone charges. The distributed amount is currently 0. If I click that button, you'll see I've now populated the distribution lines with the distribution codes we tagged to the distribution set. Because I'd set up the distribution set to spread manually, all these amounts are 0, but for the purposes of this illustration and to keep things simple, let me just type in 3,000 per line. So you can see for 3 lines it's sped up the process. Imagine if you've got many more mobile phones that you're wanting to capture detail on at the AP invoice level. This is a very nice way of making that process much more efficient. So I'll add, and then let's call that telephone from Telstra. Save and post. So there we are, there's distribution codes and distribution sets. Next I'd like to go to the terms code or the terms icon in Accounts Payable Setup. And this is the area that we set up the terms tables that we assign to each and every vendor, so that when we put in an invoice against a vendor account along with an invoice date, the system knows how to calculate the due date of the invoice. So it's quite normal to see cash on delivery at 30 days, maybe 30 days end of month, and so on. But one thing you may be interested to know is that you can also set up term codes that include multiple payment schedules. So here's a code called 90-day multiple payments, and I've elected to use days from invoice date as the due date type. So in other words, go look at the invoice date and then calculate based on a certain number of days after that the payment schedules according to the percentage due that you see here. In addition, if you're being offered early discount settlements for your, from your suppliers, you can also include that information here. So how does that work in action? Let me do an invoice now for a vendor. I'll choose my battery supplier. Okay. Put in a document number and a document total. we're going to buy a lot of batteries. Actually, before I do that, let's quickly go and change my tax. Whoops. Now, if I go to the terms code page, you'll see that because this particular vendor is set up to that terms code called 90-day multiple payments, it's already giving me the payment schedule for the total of this invoice, spread out over the due dates that you see here. And then over to the right, you're seeing what might happen from a discount settlement amount if we pay on time also. That's obviously a negotiation you'd have with your supplier. I'm more keen to highlight these two columns here, knowing that the system will automatically age the document based on these due dates. So that's a really neat and fun way of using terms codes as a way to multi-schedule payments against invoices. And I've posted that as well. So we're going to move on now from terms to payment selection codes. So what are payment selection codes? These payment selection codes are used to help you generate automatic payment runs. In fact, you can't generate an automatic payment run without having at least one payment selection code set up. So here's some sample selection codes. Now, you can have as many payment selection codes as you want. Why might you have multiple? The reason is that on the criteria page, you can use these filters to narrow down the range of vendors that you may want to include as part of an automatic payment run. So if I only wanted to include in this payment run any vendor that belonged to a vendor group called service, when I come to do my automatic payment run, I'll choose this code and it'll know to only include those particular vendors. As opposed to this one, which is just, do all vendors based on the due dates. So these payment selection codes are pretty useful. And as I say, there's really neat ways here where we can narrow down who we include as part of the payment run. But I'm going to show you a little bit more about that when we actually do a payment run in a moment or two. Before we get there, I'd like now to move to AP vendors and just highlight vendor groups and vendors. So I'm sure most of you are aware when you set up a vendor, one of the first fields you're required to input against the vendor master record is a group code. And there's a very good reason for that. The reason is that when I choose a group code, it will automatically populate the rest of the vendor master record with all this default information. Bearing in mind you can always override these fields. It's just a handy and efficient way of not having to fill out every single field when creating a new vendor account. Okay. Now there's also a way of accumulating statistics by group code. So if you are using group codes or are planning to use group codes, it's always neat if you can do them in such a way that they are meaningful from a profiling point of view, knowing that you can then pull out some pretty reasonable statistics for each of those group codes. Now moving on to the vendor screen. So remembering that Here's our group code. That's a mandatory field. You can see, by the way, that they've now started to tag mandatory fields with these little asterisks, and you see these dotted about the place in Sage 300 now. They're just to help the user know that they won't be able to add the document unless they've filled in some information. So when we go and set up a vendor, key things to do are obviously put in email addresses if you've got them. On the processing page, check your terms codes. As we've just seen with terms codes, there's some really neat options there. Have a look at the invoicing page, in particular the distribute by method. So we've seen one previously where we've selected distribute by distribution set in the case of Telstra, and then put in the distribution set for that. Now, if you want to just manually do invoices each and every time without having any pre-population on the detailed line, then you'll just choose none. The system will then not put anything in the distribution lines. You can see there's some default retainage information coming down here. If you're thinking that this is a feature that may be useful, you can update the vendor record with those terms there. And I'll show you another little option. Down the bottom of my list, I've got an account here called cash. So I've gone and created a cash account vendor. And on the processing page, I've ticked a little box here called generate separate payments for each invoice. And we'll see this come to fruition when we do our automatic payment run. What this does, though, is it allows me to enter invoices against one vendor account, in this case a cash account. But when I go to generate a payment run, rather than the system wanting to generate one payment for the entire vendor, it'll generate separate payments for each invoice against this vendor account. So generate separate payments for each invoice, that little tick box under processing in the vendor master record. So we're nearly at the automatic payment run, but just before I get there, I'm going to go to recurring payables. So that's also under AP vendors in Sage 300. Now, I don't know if you're aware, but within Sage 300, I also have the facility in Accounts Payable to set up recurring invoices. In other words, invoices that I'm going to get from my suppliers on a regular basis. And again, the whole idea here is just to increase our efficiency when it comes to creating invoices in the system. So here's one that we've created earlier for a vendor called Rayside Equipment. Now, there's a schedule code linked to this, and the purpose of the schedule code is really to determine the frequency that these invoices come in, and at the same time, potentially give us a reminder so that when we log into the system on a certain day, we'll get a handy little pop-up to help us not only remind us that it's time to run, but to actually go and create the entry for us. Now, in terms of who it reminds, you can either elect to remind all users, don't remind anybody, or choose a specific user. If I choose specific user, it'll ask me for the user ID. So by setting up this invoice once and knowing that we're going to receive it on a weekly basis for this amount, I now start to build up statistics, which are also quite useful. So here I can see the last invoice posted date, the amount, and total invoiced year to date, and total number of invoices. So how does this all fit together? So when I log in, you'll see I get a little reminder, process my weekly schedule, and if I hit process, it'll process all the transactions that relate to that weekly schedule. So if I go back to Accounts Payable and Transactions, Invoice Batch List, you can see I've got some recurring payables sitting in an open batch for rayside equipment. So again, just a neat way of saving time when it comes to recurring invoices that you know you're going to receive on a regular basis. When you set up the schedules against the recurring invoice, the schedule code here is very important. Now, you don't have to use weekly. You can set up, obviously, monthly schedules. And then I can identify the recurring periods, so you could even go monthly on every 3 months if it's a quarterly invoice. You can choose a day, or say on the first, second, third, or fourth last day. There's quite a few useful options here when it comes to setting up these schedule codes. And don't forget, as information builds up, you'll see some neat statistics against the recurring payable code. In this case for Rayside, we now see that there's 6 more unposted invoices, so clearly it's been a while since I've run my create recurring batch, and potentially the total invoice will be, if I post that batch, another 3,000. Okay, so there's a little bit about recurring payables. Next, I'm going to move on to automatic payment runs, or auto pay runs, using create payment batch. So remember those selection codes we saw earlier, where I showed how we could have a selection code that just incorporates everything, or a selection code that narrows it down, maybe based on vendor group. In this case, I'm going to choose all vendors. Now, if I just hit register, it will give me a message saying, you must enter a date in the due on or before field. So what that's asking me for is, on the criteria page, a date needs to be entered here. And this is essentially, okay, so what invoices do we want to pay based on their due dates? Okay. So in this case, I'm actually going to jump ahead in time. I'm going to select 31 January 2021. So in other words, it'll have a look at my aged payables. It'll calculate based on every document that's outstanding according to their due dates, whether they fall on or before this date. And if they do, then they'll include them as part of this potential payment batch. I say potential because we haven't actually told it to create the batch yet. Now I can preview by clicking this register button, and the system will go off and generate a neat little report that shows me what it would like to generate a batch for. So you can see there's quite a bit of payable here to Chloride System. In fact, that's way too much from my bank account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to my exclusion screen, and I'm going to take chloride out of this equation completely. So if I run that again, I don't want to see chloride on my potential payment batch. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now you'll see as I go through these There's quite a few payments going on here. If I want to jump to the end, I'll click that little button and it'll show me the total payment amount. So if I have enough money, then I'm good to go, but it may be that I actually want to cut back a bit. Now, there's a few ways I can cut back. One way is to say, well, on my criteria page, don't pay anybody that has an invoice over 10,000. So I'm going to use that number there and just see if that makes a difference. And instantly, I've reduced my total payables. And that's probably a more acceptable level for me. So I'm going to run with that for the moment. What you'll also notice is that I've got a couple of payments here to my cash account vendor, one for $2,200 and another for $3,300. But actually I'm going to hold back on the $3,300 payment. To do that, I'll just come to this Control Payments icon that sits to the right of Create Payment Batch. I'll open that up. I'll choose the vendor, and then it'll show me a list of those documents that are sitting on the system outstanding. And here, I can actually alter the due date of the invoice. So I'm going to do that, and the reason I'm going to do that is because I actually do want it to appear on my next payment run. So by changing that due date, I can be pretty sure it will. So I click the Process button, and then I close. And let's see what happens when I run this register again. So we've gone from a total originally, I think, about 76,000 down to 52, and now down to 48. So that works for me. So there's the 2,200. There was another one for 1,100, by the way, but that 3,300 invoice has now disappeared off this payment run. So can everybody see that generates separate payments for each invoice effect right here? We've got one cash vendor that had multiple invoices outstanding, and it's gone and generated separate payments for each of those outstanding documents. So the exclusion tab, very simple way of excluding vendors entirely from the payment run. And control payments, a very simple way of excluding at a document level on a vendor by vendor basis, also from the payment run. Now, just to finish this up, if I am comfortable with the outcome of my register, then I'll click the Generate button, and it'll go off and generate a payment batch. There you go. Payment batch 30 was created. I can go straight to the payment batch list, and you'll see I have a new payment batch. There's that $48,808 total. And from there, I can hit the print and post button. Now, I know a lot of you will be using EFT as part of your process. And typically for that, you'll have a check stock code here. Sorry about the American spelling, by the way. Not much we can do about that. But most of you will have a stock code called EFT with some leading numbering behind that. And the idea is that you just hit print. So in this case, it wants to generate computerized checks. Don't really want to do that, so I'll just close this. And were all checks printed successfully? If they did, I'll say yes. Now it'll say batch not set to ready to post. Do you want to post this batch? If I say yes, it will go ahead and post this batch. But if I haven't yet maybe submitted my EFT file through the bank, then I'll just say no. And it'll sit here as a generated payment run, now with EFT numbers tagged to each payment, but still with the ability to void anything if for some reason the EFT file goes to the bank and something goes horribly wrong at their end. So when I'm done, I'll come back and I'll post this. And that's gone. One thing I've noticed that I wanted to point out to you, I think this is also a 2017 Sage 300 feature. I've now got this Post All button here, and I'll just quickly highlight it because it's actually pretty cool. If I have a number of open batches and I tag them ready to post equals yes, I can now use the Post All button to post everything at once. That's I've seen that now in most of the batch entry screens in Sage 300, and I'm pretty sure that's only in 2017. Next, I'm going to show you some inquiries and reports. I'm going to start off with the payment inquiry screen. So this is also in the AP transactions folder. And it's right here, payment inquiry. And what this does is it just shows me by default every single payment that's gone through my system. There's quite a lot there. I may be better off saying, well, just show me outstanding payments. So here I've got a status, and this hooks in with the bank reconciliation function under Common Services and Bank Services, which is where you'll normally go to reconcile your outstanding payments and obviously accounts receivable as well. So if I change the status just to show me outstanding and then click these two little arrows, it will show me all the outstanding payments. In other words, those that haven't yet been presented against the bank per my bank rec. Now, in fact, you can see there's quite a long list here, which leads me to believe that whoever does my bank recs in this company, I probably need to go have a quiet word with them and find out what's going on. So if I was to look at cleared for the same date range period, there's nothing there. That suggests to me that my friend hasn't done a bank rec. Be that as it may, this is a useful screen because from here I can use my filtering options to narrow down based on payment dates. So if I want to pick up payments that were done in a certain month, I can choose the date range. So if I go 1 December, to 31 December. That narrows my list down somewhat. You can see there's our Telstra friend down here, along with the two cash account vendors. And from here, obviously, I can go and open and have a look at these. So there's some very quick information. Or I can go and have a look at the document entry itself. Now, this is the payment entry. It'll also show me the document that was paid as part of that. There we go. So that's a useful inquiry screen when it comes to doing a little bit of forensics on payments made out of the system. Now I'm going to dive back into AP vendors and go straight back to vendor groups. And the reason for this is because I want to show you, if I click on File and Print, I get an option to print out vendor group statistics. I quite like this because if I'm using vendor groups as a neat way of profiling my vendors, and then I want to see some stats against those vendors, I can just run this very quick and easy report, and I can also say include counts. Let's do that. And now I get, based on the vendor groups, counts and totals for the period I filtered, in this particular case, period 12 to period 12, 2020 to 2020. Same applies to vendors. If I go to vendors and click on File and Print, and then from the report type I choose Vendor Period Statistics, and again I can narrow the filter down, include number of documents, and now I'm getting the same information but at a drill down level on a vendor by vendor basis. Okay, we're nearly running out of time, so I want to focus quickly on the Age Payables report. So this is the one, I guess, that gets the most use from a reporting perspective in the Accounts Payable module. Most people use Age Payables by due date, and I'm sure you're all aware that we've got two date fields here. So one is basically age as of, using due dates. The other is include documents up to a particular cut-off date. Let's just run this as at 31st of Jan. I normally make these two fields the same, by the way. It just saves on any confusion. Let's make this just 31st of Jan 2021 and hit print. Okay, so I'm sure you've seen this report many times. But I want to run the same report. And this time I'm going to go overdue payables by due date. I'll leave the date fields the same, and we'll just see if we can spot the difference. Now, the reason I am doing this report is if you think of using multiple terms codes, multiple payment terms codes in future, this can add a little bit more value, because what it will do, it'll look at those payment schedules, and it'll also advise on future schedules and paid schedules according to the terms codes that were assigned to the vendors and then the subsequent invoices. So that's the use of overdue payables by due date as part of the report type options on the Age Payables report. Now, you may or may not be aware, when we run these reports, by default they print out in detail by document date, but you can also do in summary format. So a much simpler to read report, I'm sure you'll agree. If you want to default this print transactions option to summary in future, after you've chosen that, just come and click on this settings button and go save settings as defaults. All that means is the next time I come back into this screen, it'll remember that it wants to do overdue payables by due date based on summary.